Hello and welcome to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past and talk about their impact and relevance today. I'm Tim Longo Jr., and I'm joined, as always, by a man who wishes he had built an ark thanks to all of the flooding coming his way.
Brett Duville. Yeah, there's been a lot of flooding both in Maryland and in the game.
I hadn't intended the real life. Sorry.
Actually,
tragic side of it.
But. Yeah, it hasn't been too bad, but there was a lot of rain the last week here. We are of course talking about Populous, where there has been a lot of flooding. I actually marked that in my notes at one point. Hey,
for me as well.
So we will definitely get to all of that. We had aimed to play 5 additional levels this time. You had to restart, and you were away from home, so there was some.
I got some
stuff.
Definitely got some hand strain because I wasn't in my usual setup, and so this game requires quite a bit of clicking. So I basically restarted and played 5 levels, but I had to restart the tutorial as well. I didn't have to. I wanted to because I wasn't sure if the tutorial was going to impact the difficulty curve, if it was counted, and it turns out it's not.
I don't think so. I think everything is literally completely independent. Like every level is completely, there is no macro.
What I meant more is like, the way that the difficulty curve is based on how well you did in the last one. Like, there's of the 500.
That's the only macro, really.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So, but it really just starts with Genesis, the first level, and then it increments from there based on how well you do in the last one. But tutorial is separate. Tutorial doesn't connect to those. But I did figure out what I did wrong. So I misunderstood what I did last time. Once you finish the tutorial, remember, and you asked me, like, what's the name of the levels
you can keep going
playing?
in the tutorial.
Yeah, and so I basically, at the end of the tutorial, it asks you, do you want to create a new game? And so instead of going to the main menu and choosing conquest mode, right, I did new game from that button, and I think it's basically just a random new map, and that's the desert level that I played last time.
I was wondering how you got there. That had been baffling me because I didn't actually finish the tutorial. I don't think. I think I just played for a while, or actually no. I guess I just quit out and played, and started a new conquest game. That's what I did. Yeah.
So I conquered the tutorial both times, and it's actually funny. I mean, we should talk about it a little bit. It's kind of a funny tutorial. It makes sense to some degree, but going from the tutorial, having played it twice, the settings are, I didn't look at them, or even if you can see them, but the settings must be quite a bit different in the tutorial, which would make sense to make it inviting to people to some degree. But the mana generation is 3 or 4 times, right? So
that's right. It's true.
So, you get kind of a false sense of security, playing that tutorial twice, like I did. And so
I think you must start with more people.
That's probably, that's true for sure. You already have a lot of houses set down.
Right.
Yeah. So maybe that's all they had to do.
It just set it up with a lot of, that's interesting because there have been some of these later levels. I've started with 2 and 3 people.
Yeah, me too.
And you've got nothing.
Yeah.
And the mana is so slow. There's times where I'm like clicking, I'm like, why is this not raising? Am I not lined up? Am I off the map? Same. And then I'll look and I'll be like, oh man, I'm out. Which can be immediate as well. There are huge swings where suddenly you'll have no mana very unexpectedly, and it's because something bad has happened somewhere you can't see. But we'll get to that. Let's talk about it being such a clicking game, because that's something you pointed out as a kind of topic that I was thinking about that. Like, there was not as much of that in 1989. I was still playing a lot of games that were heavily keyboard games. I had mentioned Prince of Persia last week was one that, that's all keyboard control as far as I recall. So stuff contemporaneously. I think couple of years later, something like Civ would have been a lot more clicking. But here it's way more clicking than I expected for 1989. I mean, I also played like an Ultima in '89. Would have been probably 6, maybe 7. I can't remember, but yeah, maybe that's even a couple of years later. And that's not, that's a lot of moving around via keyboard as well. So this is definitely ahead of the curve in some ways.
Yeah, I mean it's the thing that popped that kind of jogged. I'm looking up some dates here on some other influential mouse gameplay games. I'm looking at Doom 2 specifically, which was 94.
Right, 93 and 94 were Doom 2.
Yeah, and then Quake is 96. So it's like in 89, the thing that occurred to me that I think we take for granted, especially when we play for the podcast and anyone who's going backwards to play some of these older games, which who knows how many people are playing Populous these days. But yeah, I mean, this was in an era where even the interface on how to utilize a personal computer was evolving for video games. There were a lot of assumptions being made. And even in our last series, we talked about sort of text adventures, and then we played King's Quest and Space Quest, which were, text-based inputs, etc. And then at the same time, you have LucasArts, who's fooling around with verb-based stuff in the same adventure game space, which involved navigating to some degree those menus / some mouse interfaces were popping in the early games and stuff. But everyone was trying to figure out, like, okay, basically the point is that even just the things we take for granted today when it comes to interfacing with a PC game were evolving. And so in 89, like how you raise and lower land on this weird genre that had never been seen before, or subgenre. There were, like we talked about last episode, there were a couple competitors, if you will, that, Civ being turn-based and SimCity being simulation based, but still not with like threats involved, right? I mean, you're managing something that's growing and living and breathing, but and so the mouse was kind of gaining its momentum, really, in a way. I mean, of course, you have Apple, you have Windows, right? And you have things that have been evolving from that side of things, but how games use that stuff. I mean, even like back in this era, there was, I can't remember the game, but I was playing FPSs with a flight stick. There were some games that would actually support it and boast. In fact, I think Dark Forces did. We talked about that with Dark Forces.
Dark Forces, right? Did. Yep.
Where
Doom actually supported a mouse, but it didn't. It didn't feel right.
I think, right. It wasn't.
I think you would move as well with the mouse. I don't remember exactly.
Well, it
feels weird.
I mean, we talked about it last episode a little bit too with Underworld, right? Where it's like their solution to mouse use was actually clicking on the screen to the arrows that you wanted to, to aim your camera rather than free look, mouse look. Which, and the reason I looked up Quake is Quake was really the game that cemented mouse look as a concept.
Right. Yes.
For first person games.
Doom's was really weird. It did not feel right.
Yeah, and
because it would move you at the same time as as looking.
Yeah, and then I think Duke 3D was one that started to push on those, the mouse look boundaries, and then but the reason I looked up Quake is Quake was 96, and that's actually quite a few years later, where the mouse was really, and then we played Diablo and stuff. But anyway, it just kind of dawned on me that, how to utilize, and probably as my hand was killing me, it was as why I was thinking about it, how the mouse was an undiscovered country in and of itself, for games at least. And you can kind of tell with this game because, I mean, it's a little bit, it's laggy. It's the usability of it's not great. And I don't think it's necessarily because we're playing this DosBox version, but where where the cursor, how the cursor behaves, it's definitely not usable. So they were just trying to figure out how to use the same stuff at the time. And I'm sure if we look backwards, there's some clear influences to them, for them on why they're doing it this way. But it just kind of dawned on me that, this wasn't a time.
It was an Amiga forward. This was developed on Amigas, I believe. So that might be part of it as well. And in fact, I'll bring in a correction from last time. You had asked me if it was the Populous postmortem that Molyneux had done, where he told an anecdote, which I'll also clear up. It was, in fact, I went and found it, and in 2000, it must have been one of the very first ones. He was also a Lifetime Achievement Award winner that year, so I guess that's why I get the things confused. But he also gave this classic postmortem, and it was about Populous. And he did, in fact, tell the anecdote of how they got the computers. They were not mismailed to them. That I got wrong, although I didn't watch the talk again. He may have kind of indicated that. What actually happened, this is nuts. So he had a company in Guildford called Torus, like the astrological symbol or the car. Was the name of his company. I'm a Taurus. You are in fact a Taurus, and
that's what
Warcraft.
That's why I played Tauren in World of Warcraft. Yeah. Continue.
So he was a bull man. His company was a bull man. His company was formed to import baked beans into the Middle East. What? No joke. This was what Torus did. There was another company. Yes, this is actually what he was doing with his life in 1987 or whatever. Another company in the UK was also called Torus, like the geometric shape commonly known as a donut. Torus. But when Amiga went looking, or maybe it was Commodore, now that I think about it. Oh, Amigas were the same company, I think.
No.
No?
No, I'm saying no to where this is going.
They sent a letter to Torus, the Peter Molyneux baked bean importer, thinking it was Torus, the computer software developer, inviting him to come see the new Amiga at their place of business, and gave him one, thinking he was these programmers in somewhere else, maybe also in Guildford, I don't even know. And thus a new company was born. Peter Molyneux is a salesman. He basically sold them on the spot that he could make a game for their system, and we have however many years of Peter Molyneux to thank. We have that to thank for how many 30-something years of Peter Molyneux. So,
holy cow,
it's extraordinary.
22 Cans is in Guildford as well.
He's
always been there.
He's always been there. Bullfrog was always there. He was always based there. I'm sure he had to move around a bit more when he was, Microsoft for EA and Microsoft. But yeah.
Oh,
well, I guess just Microsoft, not really EA, because he left so soon after. But yeah, pretty wild.
That's hilarious. It's even better than them being accidentally
delivered.
That he actually. So well, I don't know. Maybe he didn't say, but did he say that he probably never told them the error?
I didn't watch. I just watched that far because I was like, I know he talked about this at the beginning of the talk, and I started watching it just to make sure it was the right talk, and they started talking about this. I was like, oh my god, that's right. So sure enough,
how funny,
pretty wild.
And he was a programmer on the game, so he taught himself, or maybe he was already. I don't know how big.
I think probably he taught himself.
Yeah, that's great. Wow. It makes the game, it makes Populous specifically even more interesting then.
Yeah, it really does.
This was the first thing that they made when this weird.
Yeah, they did. They had done a shooter the year before called Fusion. And then I think they had done one or maybe two ports as well. So they had gotten their feet wet beforehand, but yeah, he basically formed a company around a mistake.
Funny.
And yeah.
The rest
good
is
for
history.
him. The rest is history.
Huh.
I highly recommend that talk. We probably went to that talk together.
We probably did. Yeah, I would never have remembered. But yeah, I mean, I went to all of those as they were. Whenever I was there, I would go to the postmortems. So, geez, how wild. Yeah. So, I mean, anyway, I mean, Amiga being sort of the root, the core platform would explain quite a bit, but also because the PC platform space at that time was kind of weird in that there were a lot of different competitors that all had different spins on how they were making game, what aspects, because I remember, having,
I mean, Macs had one button.
Yeah, exactly.
Mac at the time, they had one button, one button on the mouse,
one button. So you have Macs, you have IBM and IBMs and IBM clones, you have Commodore 64s or Commodore 128s or what have you. You have Amigas. So it was a very weird time. And so making a game like this that would eventually be on multiple PC platforms seems like a pretty big challenge. Of course, we're not going to play it on any other platform, but it just like we just jumped.
I wanted this went on the SNES, I think, as well.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm sure. Yeah, it's like, which explains maybe how they got to 1 million, but it just we just jumped in, obviously, because we got it on GOG, and so we just jumped in and started playing, and then I just wanted to take a step back and think about that for a second, at least, so we can move on. But it's just a reminder of that was something that as developers they were grappling with, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
How are you going to quickly raise and lower land? So it'd be interesting to look. We I don't know if I'll get a chance to do it, but it'd be interesting to see what the controls were on other platforms like Mac and stuff, and how they dealt with because it's so heavily dependent right now on, at least in this version, on 2 mouse buttons.
I can't even imagine what it would look like, even if it presents in basically the same way, but how you would control it with a controller. That seems...
Yeah, you'd have to move around manually.
So much moving around in this game, which has been... Yes, one of the issues for sure. It doesn't have any of the niceties of later RTSs of being able to sort of bind a key to a unit to quickly go to them with like shift 1 or whatever, control 1 or control 2 to go to different groups and things like that. This is all click up in the mini map in the upper left to go to a particular place, and then try to immediately figure out where you are. But when you look back to the 3D map, have the controls down in the lower left, but have to look to the upper right to see which ones are available. Super strange.
Are there any hotkeys for moving the main map around rather than just clicking on the arrows? Like
not that I have found. I did mess around. I messed around with the function keys because I was curious. And we had a very brief email that I want to cite after the main discussion about that. But yeah, there are basically a bunch of keys for the moving to like the magnet or your leader or the knight, if you have any. There are buttons for that in the function keys that I just kind of happened upon randomly, like say F9 and F10 to go to the previous knight and the next knight, for example. I don't know that that's exactly what it is. I couldn't imagine doing that. My function keys aren't super easy to read, like they're not. I've been playing on a laptop, so I can kind of get up and away from it easily. But it doesn't have a typical function key layout where it's really easy to see the groups of 4, for example. So it's been right. I would never try to play that this way on this keyboard, but it did have those, but it didn't have one for movement that I found. Maybe the arrow keys. Didn't try it.
I think I tried the direction. I don't know if I tried the number pad. That would make logical sense because there's nine buttons. But anyway, yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, that was because this was the first one, and because of the, like we just talked about, the era of interfacing that was happening, the kind of interfacing that was happening in this era. I can totally imagine them not thinking of that. Right? It's an obvious thing we would say now today, but you figure that out in the second, third, fourth iterations of things.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
we're as we talked about last time, we're playing the first iteration, which I think is going to end up being more interesting than I thought. Not to change, to maybe to segue a little bit, but one surprise to me for this session was there was more depth going on. It's still not going to be deep enough, I think, for us to go too many episodes with, but there was definitely a lot more going on in this session for me than the last one. And, things like I was thinking about early, mid, and late game phases. I could break down how the early game feels different, and how I got over these certain humps to get to the mid game, and then how I know when I'm ready to go to the late game kind of thing, which I didn't anticipate. I figured it was going to be fairly chaotic all of the time, and like not really having any identifiable sort of transitions, if you will, that happen where you're ready to go do a thing, even though you're not directly controlling anybody.
I think it's that indirection that makes it not be arcadey. It feels like it wants to be arcadey in some ways. Like, like you want to, like I can remember in Sim Ants, which would have been around this time, actually, maybe a year or two later, you could control, like you could grab control of like the spider and just like run around and wreak havoc wherever you wanted to. Which was a lot of fun and felt very arcadey. And this just does, I think that's part of what makes this thing develop in the weird way that it does. I think it's a dynamic. I don't think that's naturally even something that they naturally coded. I think it just happens because of scale, right? You've got, there's this many units, so he can do more things, right? He the enemy. I should say they, because they are evil, while we are good. But yes, they have more opportunities to mess with you as time goes on. And I mean, the way I noted that was just to say more strategy was coming into play, but dividing it into feeling like there are distinct phases of the game absolutely is true.
Well, like for instance, like we talked about it in pre-show, but manna comes into play in these, once you get out of the tutorial and past the first level or two. Even in and so the early game in a way is managing that to where you get enough population to the point where mana is to raise and like you can't even raise and lower land,
right?
Because you don't have enough population and mana building up more quickly enough.
And for me, I mean, this was in the most frustrating level. I mentioned this in pre-show. For me, I had I guess it was this rock and lava level where I started at a higher position than the enemy and was constantly, the first several times I restarted, was constantly trying to raise the land up to the level that all my other units were, which was a losing strategy because it cost so much more mana to raise the land that far, and I wasn't generating enough to do that quickly. When I changed my strategy to just build out as low as I could on the sea of lava to my east, I finally had success. But it was touch and go for a long time. And that was part of the reason why it took me a long time to even realize, why is he dominating? He's got all this land. I mean, then I looked at the little mini map and I could see, his is all very flat. He just developed away from me as flat as he could. And so I just copied and did the same thing and turned out to be successful.
Yeah, I had a similar level where, and for the audience, we talked about this in pre-show, but when you finish Genesis, based on your score, I guess, they assign you the next level you're going to play of the 500 levels. And so you kind of jump, I guess unless you do poorly, you're gonna skip levels. So just because of that way that works, Brett and I didn't play any of the same levels.
Right.
We were just kind of off by one or so. And so that happened to me. I didn't really kind of realize it. So we both, I think, have flooding stories to tell. So how, because what I was about to talk about was going to segue into that.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go and tell mine really quick? And then
go ahead. Sure. Yeah.
because I had a kind of a very funny, I thought funny and unexpected series of events happen. So on Genesis, let's see, it might have been the level after Genesis. I forget exactly the order. I think it might have been Genesis. Genesis is pretty easy, right? It's the first level, and obviously I was dominating at one point. And I'd flattened out, and and really was like, had lots of castles and lots of knights running around, and I felt really good. I probably was, population wise, on the little bars, on the shield, I was probably double what he had. So I was like, okay, good. So I'm going to experiment a little bit and try to fool around. And so I let my mana go up as high as I could because I wanted to see what the flood thing was going to do. And I was fooling around with all the other natural disasters like volcanoes or mountains or whatever that one is where a big mountain occurs, right, to totally decimate them. So I'd built a couple. I'd thrown a couple volcano or mountains. Are they volcanoes?
It's a volcano. Yeah.
Okay.
It's supposed to be like a volcano.
Okay, that's odd, but okay. So I put volcanoes, so I totally messed him up, which gave me even more of an advantage. And so he had a obviously like 3 or 4 peaks in his in the middle of his land. Then I finally got enough for the flood, and so I was like, good, I'm going to do this. Let's try this out. And I hit flood. Now, of course, all of my land, which I had completely dominated, and was like half of the over half of the map was mine, and it was all flat and low. I basically flooded everybody, including myself, completely obliterating my population except for one knight who was gallivanting around on the mountains or the volcanoes that I did on his land.
That you had made. Oh my goodness! Yeah.
So I basically killed. So I had no way to get a new. I could not repopulate, right? Because I had no villager to go create a. I don't think knights will do that.
No, they won't.
I had no villager to go, and I don't even know where my holy symbol was. I guess it was gone or something, underwater. So, it was like my knight and a couple, like 3 of their guys running around on this mountain. And I was like, okay, well, let's see how this goes. So for like the next 10 or 20 minutes, I just like let it play out. And I was trying to basically ensure that he could kill them off by doing some other like earthquakes and stuff. But ultimately they just wore him down, and he couldn't keep up with their, he would kill a bunch of them and then one would pop up.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
Run over there and kill him.
Yeah.
So he just couldn't do it by himself. So I just loved that I had, screwed myself so badly.
Yeah.
Of course, I lost because they eventually overtook him, and he, I guess, died. But he was super powered up by that point. Like, he was a very powerful knight, so he was just laying waste to everybody. But that was it. It was basically these 2 mountains, this one knight, and like the rest of the map was water. And so in the next level, I was like, okay, now I'm gonna keep this in mind for the flood system because there's more going on there than I had realized. And so on the next level, I built up. Assuming that he could use it on me. And so I built up my whole land, which you made a good point earlier that, of course, if you build up, that costs you more mana early game. So it's actually pretty expensive to do. I did manage to do it somehow. Had a bunch of, I had great civilization up there, built up, and he ended up using and he was not building up. And so he ended up using the flood, and he took himself out in that same process. And so it was a very interesting like comparison between the 2 levels because, I did this to myself and learned a valuable lesson. And then I used that strategy in the next level, to essentially build almost defensively, right? Assuming that he could use flood on me at some point like I had, or even to prepare myself if I wanted to use it eventually, but he got there first. So he flooded, and then essentially the rest of the map was water, and my higher civilization with all of my castles was fine, and I won on that one. So anyway, that was it was a funny series of events that happened there the story I just told was not a story that I would have anticipated,
right.
Saying on the, or describing on the podcast. There's just more going on there than I had anticipated.
Yeah, for me, I mean, mine was sort of similar, except that I was the enemy in that story. Although I had higher ground, I I recognized that he was all in low level ground, and it was my strategy. I had noticed like, oh, I'll be able to flood. I had actually built out, like you had, a lot of land that was low lying. But I was like, but I have a lot of people in the mountains, and he was entirely actually low land. There was no mountains for him at all. So I didn't use volcano on him ever. I didn't use earthquake, although I think earthquake doesn't ever raise land. I think it might change the height between 0 and 1, but I don't think it goes up higher than that.
It doesn't seem to.
Yeah, it seemed like it always just kept it low enough. So flood would still work. So I could have used that, I suppose. But I had built out a lot, of space and spread to another island that was very low, and built it up a bit, knowing I would lose half my population to flood, but like knowing also, but they'll be gone. But that's when I discovered that the computer cheats in that it generated like 6 islands in a very, very short period of time, way faster than a human could do it, which, is not an uncommon tactic for AI of the day. You're sort of not trying to beat a human player.
Rubber banding.
Yeah, it is basically rubber banding of a sort. And yeah, so they basically cheat that, and that's fine. I did it several times, which was also kind of a grim climate change model as well, because the mountains where I had a lot of stuff were very high, and I kept building them up at that point, like, well, I'll just do it again just out of curiosity, and he just always had enough mana to build up a number of islands. So I ended up making, he couldn't really at that point generate tons. I don't know if he was trying to hold off. It might have been that I had finally hit him enough that he didn't have enough mana to really build up, because he ended up not having a lot of buildings on those things, but I ended up having to run knights down there and do it. But I was overall using a lot more of the spells, and I used the swamp as well in the most difficult one that had to restart a lot. That's a good one to use, as it turns out. It's because they're actually very efficient at building a lot of flat land with a lot of the biggest building, castles on.
Yeah,
and they'll just kind of build that out very quickly. Sort of be like building honeycombs. They'll build a ton of that, and you can disrupt that pretty well with either earthquakes or swamps. And it seems like the swamps they don't even handle as well. To handle a swamp, you have to basically lower it all the way to 0 and all the way to whatever the base is, lava or water, and then raise it again to get rid of the swamp.
Oh, okay. Maybe that's what that alien was putting in then. It must have been a swamp alien or something.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I did have an alien show up in this level as well, which was
you did? Okay, I was wondering.
Yeah, but he put down mountains.
How funny. Okay.
It was very frustrating because that was one of the times where I was finally getting the hang of it. The other thing that I strategy-wise found I had to spend a lot more time on, especially in the early game, but it could really happen at any point. It tended to happen early enough that I'd go, now I'm done, I can't recover, was managing what's called the papal magnet, which is the spot on your map where if you hit, head to the symbol, the papal magnet symbol, the Ankh. Is it an Ankh? It's kind of an Ankh.
Yeah.
Thing.
I think it's
not exact. Is it an Ankh? Yeah. Anyway, whatever it is.
Pretty sure.
But to go to that symbol on the map, wherever it is, and it's also the symbol that's attached to your leader. But that thing will move. If you make a knight out of your leader, wherever that happens, that'll be where the magnet drops. Or if your leader dies or enters a building, and becomes like a permanent occupant or something, I'm not sure really what's happening there, but basically they stop being the leader, the papal magnet drops. And the enemy is really good at noticing that, and going after it if it's close enough that it can get to it, and basically putting the magnet behind enemy lines, at which point it becomes very difficult to get people there to become leaders and move the magnet around. You can't move the magnet without a leader. So once the magnet's behind enemy lines, you may be done. So I ended up spending a lot of time on the behaviors as well, way more Turns out you really want early in the game, if you're close to the other guy, I would have thought you wanted to be in settle mode and try to like build your settlement away from him. Mm-hmm. But being in fight mode that during that time tends to be really important. I don't really understand that, because it doesn't really push them to fight so much as they will sort of push to fight, but they'll also settle as they go. So they're kind of more aggressive, but also still settling. I don't know what that's supposed to indicate, but I did find that was the winning strategy, is like build out a lot of land away, directionally away from the enemy. Let spread into that space as well as you can. Hopefully it's got it's cut off enough that they can't get to it, and manage your papal magnet like madness. I mean, just like put it in the middle of a bunch of castles and build and build and build until you're ready to tackle them with a knight or whatever. So those are the strategies that evolved for me. I don't know if as this game gets more difficult, if I'm gonna have to do more stuff. So
yeah, I mean, it is kind of the fascinating question with this thing, because it's the way that everything's interacting is, because I never really delved into these games, so I didn't really know what to expect. And coming from Civ or something like that, maybe I was thinking there were some elements at least that were similar. But because it's not passive, but it's a automated kind of game, and you're not directly controlling anything. It does create interesting combinations of watching this, basically the computer do its thing. And I've also been very surprised at how big of an impact the map, especially the starting map, but just as the map evolves, how big of an impact it has on the strategy of things. Not, just obviously as you've been listening, you can probably assume, or you've already assumed, that the obvious example of that is if each group, if you and your enemy start on their own islands, right, then there is going to naturally be a different built-in early game, because you're separated. And right. So you can only both expand as much as you can expand, and you'll both expand toward each other, because the goal of the game is to conquer the other, to wipe out the other civilization or what have you. And so the rhythm is the same, but then depending on how the map is and where each person starts and how many they have, there's a lot of variables that mix things up pretty quickly. And Brett got deeper into this than I did, but I don't know why I didn't think that was going to be as big of a thing as it is, but the whole, and then combining that with manipulating the land being sort of the core interface or the core thing you're doing, which is also just super weird to me. It's just such a funny thing. And then both creating land bridges to go to your enemy and also destroying them so they can't get to you. And then I had actually in one of the flooding stories that I just told, their leader had, during one of the floods, had basically been left on this one tiny island by himself through the course of those of those events. And so it was, I could basically kind of take that, use that to my advantage, because he was essentially isolated for a while. And I don't know why they didn't build up so quickly, when you start as they did for you, because when you start the levels, it shows you kind of the settings for that level. And one of the, two of the settings are sort of how aggressive they're going to be and how fast they are. And so it could be that the one I played, they weren't in fast mode,
I think they were all slow for a while. Like, I think that's one of the dials they're going to turn up. I don't think we're going to get anywhere near the end of this game. I think there's more depth here than I expected, but I also don't think there's a lot more. Yeah. It is interesting to think about this as an RTS, because it is, right. It's just it's not the type of RTS we think of. When we think of your Warcrafts and your whatever, Dune and Command and Conquer, etc. And it has some of the same problems as far as the AI goes, right? In that I can remember from the time of people writing things in Game Developer Magazine or what have you about how to analyze the map, right? I mean, basically you have to do an analysis of the map as the AI planner to figure out like what is a choke point? What does a choke point look like? And I don't think doing any of that here because the units are all fairly simple. What they're doing more is thinking about it in terms of because any except for water or lava or whatever, any unit can cross any height, if it wants to. I don't know if it moves slower, but it can cross them. Yeah, so there's no real barrier as far as that goes. They don't have to do that sort of analysis. They can just make spatial determinations, like, can I grab more space? Do I want to, can I get to this guy? And that actually can be pretty simple and yet hugely dynamic based on that starting map. I had a map where there was it was that one where I started off really high and they were making really big flat area. There was another island. Often if there's a landmass that neither of us occupy, I'm thinking, I'm going to build a bridge to that as fast as I can because I want to have that land for me.
Right.
And I'm just trying to get to that space. So I'm building, on my whatever landmass I'm on, trying to get to the edge of that. Because you can't just raise and lower land anywhere.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that that's actually one small little subtle rule that I discovered that how it worked kind of accidentally. I didn't read it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
But it's a very simple rule that actually makes a huge impact on how the game's going to how it's going to evolve over the course of a level. And it's basically just, obviously for those who aren't playing, if you don't have it basically comes down to your flag, your blue flag. It's essentially a building. If you don't have a building, but it really is the blue flag, because you can have a corner of a castle on screen and you still can't build. So if you have one of your buildings on screen, in the main screen below, you can raise and lower, but if you don't, you can't. So it basically creates this flow of colonizing, I guess, or building, or settling is what is it settling? Is that what they call it? Or what is the?
I guess it's settling.
Settling.
Yeah.
And so you can't, you have to grow your civilization to travel, essentially, right? To have,
right,
because you can't control anybody other than the Ankh, which I guess you also can't place that any place that you don't have a building nearby, or is that?
No, you can place it anywhere. You can place it anywhere, but you have to have a leader. You have to have a leader.
Yeah, that's the tricky. Yeah, and later, like yourself, in the last level I played, I definitely got a better handle on manipulating the sort of how to use the leader and how to kind of use the leader to trailblaze colonize or settling, because you can have him start settling even by himself. But yeah, anyway, that was a nice little subtle, like, oh, okay, that's how that works. So now I know the limitations are basically my boundaries of my civilization, right? And you're kind of you're inching, you're ever encroaching, in the direction you want. So
yeah, the AI here seems, although I do think there's sort of a higher level AI, the AI for the units feels very much like Game of Life kind of level, a little bit more complex than that, but not tons. The Conway's Game of Life, where there's just sort of simple rules that lead to these very complicated patterns. I think it's more, or a cellular automata is another sort of general case where it's like, well, there's a couple rules for how you add a thing. You turn a bit on or off. Here it seems very, very similar. They seem to do kind of a random walk, but maybe generally away from where they left, and then they kind of Brownian motion their way until they get to a place where they're like, this seems like I could build here. Regardless of whether it would be the best place to build. It's super interesting to watch. I'd be super interested in a like a screensaver or just AI versus AI mode of this game where I just watch it play, because it's very interesting to, like, I wonder if you could intuit those rules after a while. I mean, maybe you do, playing dozens of games, you kind of figure that stuff out. But I found myself really drawn to that after I kind of got some of this higher level strategy, these phases that you were talking about. I started being really curious about what was going on. I slowed the computer way down, which is I'll talk about in the email section. But but just to watch more of what was going on. Like, what do they do? There are definitely times where they just seem to disappear, and I don't know if it's that they moved far enough that they could get to a building and I couldn't tell, or to join with another walker and make that walker stronger. So there's just some weirdness with that, and I don't really know. I have not been able to figure out what's going on there. But it's wild.
How they go into buildings and use buildings, and how they combine and all that stuff is definitely very mysterious. Did you ever? I tried to, because you can do a thing where you have like a question mark kind of like query state. You can put the cursor in, and then you can then attach that to a unit and then follow it essentially.
Right.
And I did that a couple of times just to sort of see if I could figure out.
Yeah, it's one of the steps in the tutorial, but I never. Yeah. I found I had too much else to do to spend time on that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was on one of the levels that I was way ahead or something, so I felt like I was going to fool around with it. But I tried to kind of I did that to see if I could figure out what's going on with the bars, for the unit, and how they kind of have those two bars that. And I know they talk about it in the manual, so I'll probably go back and reread that. But I just like, and I've been very strategy wise. I've been very knight centric, which probably you are too. I mean, and so that, even though you can do the natural disasters that are above sort of the knight level when it comes to how much mana you have, I tend to really like anytime I get up to the amount of the mana that I can make a knight, I will do that, and I will just kind of churn them out. So
I have started holding back on them actually because of the papal magnet management part of it.
So what do you mean?
Well, because that'll move the magnet, and I won't have a leader.
Right.
So it really depends where the leader is. So I actually will. I will spend a lot more time of like, okay, let me put the magnet down, attract everybody to the magnet. That'll move the leader closer to that. So it's gonna stay behind behind the lines. Then I might even do then there'll be a bunch of people there. So I'll like, I might make a knight at that point, and then immediately put it into go to the magnet again. So they get a new leader very soon and move the magnet.
Right.
So I'm always like making sure, especially if that's happening close to the enemy line, like I don't want to get that thing stranded, because that way lies death.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I did get into that state a couple of times. I got the enemy's religious symbol behind my enemy lines quite a few times too, and then would kind of surround it and.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's definitely valuable.
And they don't like that. They throw a lot at that. Yeah.
Right.
They know that's bad. That's definitely
and I find that there's a big chunk of time when I have the go to the papal magnet behavior on for a lot of large chunks, because to your point, like I'm basically bringing my civilization there to create knights, you know what I mean? So I'll actually focus on that quite a bit to avoid it being lost behind enemy lines, but also to focus. But the reason I brought the knight stuff up is I was trying to follow, because you can have knights that survive quite a while because they kind of level up, I guess, and combine with other things. I'm going to have to fool around with the gather thing now and see what that does, if how that impacts everything from a leveling up perspective.
Yeah, it means you'll start with a tougher knight. It basically, if you watch it carefully, I mean, it's sometimes very hard to tell who's going to end up being the leader. I'm trying to figure that out. I guess you could pause at any time and just like query around and see, is my leader pretty tough?
It's just so opaque. Yeah,
it is very opaque, and there's no easy way to get around them. It's not like you can make sure you'll see everyone. You just kind of have to remember which ones you've looked at and things like that. So there's definitely some usability issues, because the units are non-differentiated. It's very, I mean, they have data, you just can't just see it, right? And that's definitely a usability thing that would come later. You've made your, I don't know, whatever, your peon into a spearman, into a whatever, et cetera, to be able to tell, oh, okay, I can just look at it and I know roughly what its strength is. I mean, that's the same is true of Civ in a turn-based setting. The other thing I found myself doing, here's another weird strategy I was trying to use to promote better settling. I would sometimes lower the ground in the middle of a castle, just one, just so the castle would go away. So I'd get a bunch of new settlements. So they'd all basically run out of the castle and now be like, oh, I've got to build something. So that was another thing I did.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, so, but does
I don't know that that's helpful, to be honest. One thing that the castles do that's different from the other buildings is a castle takes up a bunch of, it has a lot of farmland around it, right? Flat connected land.
Yeah.
But then it has a border.
Yeah.
That nothing else can use.
Right.
So there's
a buffer around it.
There's a buffer around it, like it has a moat or something, even though it doesn't. It's just kind of weird. It's like,
it's there is nothing more gratifying though than trying to go after lots of castles and then getting that perfect whatever it is, 9x9 square or whatever, and you're like, and then it pops up. The only reason I've been so castle focused, to be honest, is the scoreboard at the end of every level
has it,
tells you how many castles you made. So I'm like, okay, well, I want that to be high, so I'm going to just focus on that. But to your point, I don't really know, what. If
I think it dramatically impacts the score. So
got it.
You end up, I actually wrote down the numbers of my scores because I was I wanted to just notice. And my first couple of games were 70 in the mid 70s K, 74, 78K. And then I had 124K and I jumped only 5 levels. I guess you jumped 6 from Genesis. Although you had then played a whole bunch of levels and I had only played 2. So, cause you were playing it and the tutorial and something else a second time. So,
I'm looking at.
You went from like 0 to 6 to 10. I went 0, 4, 8, 12, 17. So it was like 4, 4, 4, 5, 4 again.
Got it.
So
and
that's we should probably end on that topic because we kind of alluded to it several times. There are 500 levels in Populous, but unless you play really poorly, in the sense that you only win scraping out each victory, you will certainly not play all 500. Based on the score you get, it determines which level to send you to next. And I assume that is basically a sort of dynamic difficulty. Like you could play it quickly if you were really, really good at Populous. You could go, 20 at a time or something like that. I mean, like, I don't know what the range is on this. But
it's basically like what speedrunning Populous look like.
Exactly. Yeah. What does speedrunning Populous look like? Like you're amazing on Genesis and you get all the landmass, you make 1 million castles and you jump up to level, 100. It's very funny.
Yeah, it's funny. It'd be interesting to know how the score breaks down exactly. So I'm looking, I think this might have been my Genesis final score. Because I just took pictures of the screen, but it didn't tell me obviously the level. So I should make note of that. But I think so. This was 144K on that one, and then I think the next one was 88K or something like that. So that was maybe that's why I jumped to 6, because that level. And then maybe that was the second one. So Genesis might have been 130K and then 144K. So anyway, I don't know. I mean, it is interesting to know, like, do you want a lot, like for this, how they calculate that final score? Do you want a lot of land? Do you want a lot of buildings? Or is it speed based, or how many? They also note in the scoreboard how many battles happened and how many you won,
right?
Essentially. And so it's like, do you want to make sure you don't lose lose battles, or is it, I'm sure it's all of the above, but battles won. Yeah, so there's like 652 versus 136 on that one that I got that high score on. So I had 7 knights.
That's good.
They do list towns separately. So I had 80 towns and 12 castles. So yeah, I wish I knew which one that was. But anyway, yeah, what a weird, yeah. I mean,
I'm looking, but it looks like Populous is
score
not
calculation.
Really, no, I looked for that, but I couldn't find it. It's hard to find something with Populous.
Right.
Turns out. I was looking to see if anybody speed runs it.
Oh yeah, what a funny speed run that would be. That's
but I
gotta
don't.
there can't be. It's such a what does that even mean? When
I
what a
mean,
niche what a
I mean,
niche speed run.
is very well. They're all
They
they're all
are.
like yeah. It looks like these are all for Populous, the beginning, maybe, and not the original Populous. I've not been able to find one that's clearly the original Populous. So yeah, it's wild. It is wild.
I mean, it's a way wackier game than I had thought it would be. But at the same time, there, we talked about how many copies it sold, and how popular it was at the time, which does make sense as I'm playing it now because it is so fresh and kind of weird and unique and different. But at the same time, like there's a kernel of an idea here. The way that the sort of the automation of the you're no direct control, the automation of things, the God manipulation of the world. There's a kernel here that completely you see how a genre was formed from this game. Like
Oh yeah.
there's something here. This in
Yep.
this iteration definitely flawed, definitely weird. Not something you'd want to play. I'd want to play for 100 hours or something, but you can see the potential for sure.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what I was going to be looking for, but now that even what little I've played, I can totally see that.
Yeah, one additional game that it makes me think of, another game I didn't play much of, is Darwinia, the
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
RTS from probably the early to mid aughts. I can't remember exactly when. Do you remember the name of those guys? Their company.
They're the ones that did that nuclear. Aren't they the
Yeah,
ones
they
that
did the War Games game.
the War Games game?
Yeah,
That was them, right? That it was.
Yes. Introversion. They did do the nuclear.
What's
The
that
nuclear.
called? Anyway,
Yeah,
um,
I'm looking that up too.
Darwinia wasn't done by. It was done by them. You're
Yes.
positive. Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah. They did Darwinia for sure.
Okay.
DEF CON.
Yep.
DEF CON.
DEF CON, right? Yeah.
Darwinia came out in 05 and DEF CON in 06 and Uplink in 2001. So those are all. It was a good first few games. They most recently, I think, was Prison. Oh, it looks like they've done something else called Scanner Sombra. Anyway, interesting because also Brits. So maybe calling back to their heritage. They went with a very simple art style. It takes place, I think, inside a computer. There's some evolution stuff in there, so it is itself an evolution of this sort of game, but has that same sort of feel of like some independent units that you don't sort of directly control as much. I don't know. It's interesting. It's funny because this is not a style I think that has generally survived. Because the RTS, the Warcraft and Command and Conquer, etc., derived RTS so dominated, and strategies are a lot more clear in that because everything's direct.
I think the indirectness is definitely would be a turn off for a lot of people.
I would tend to agree. So
although I was looking, like I mentioned, noticing where 22 Cans is based in Guilford as well. I was on their site looking at just to kind of see what is happening with them today. And it did jog my memory that I wanted to look at Goddess, which is one of their semi-recent games. It's still a few years old, but
yeah, it's their last game, 2016 or so.
Yeah, so, but that is what if Peter and a team of people that that he put together were to do a modern something of this ilk. So I kind of wanted to see what it was all about. So I assume there's an indirect side of it, but maybe that's a bad assumption.
Yeah, I would expect it would have to be. I think because that's also a game that is meant to be massively massive, right? Just like that was why Curiosity, what's inside the cube, was supposed to be a technical test for it. Like, how can we have as many people as we can tapping on their phones at the same time to to impact the same cube, which is just weird.
Yeah.
And that is just so out there as an idea. I mean, I've loved a lot of Peter Molyneux's games, and that's great and all, but I love having Peter Molyneux in the industry more than anything. I mean, it's just like, sure, some of the games have been great. You know, I had a blast with, for example, Dungeon Keeper. This one's super weird. I liked Fable. Both Fable 1 and 2 I played, I think, and liked both of them. I don't know that I played Fable 3, but I mean, just more than anything, I just like the weird ideas he throws out into the world, including Curiosity, which was just such a weird thing to exist in the time that it did. You know, and yeah, sure, it's going to be life-changing if you're the person who gets to the middle, blah, blah, blah. You're like, the audacity of just the idea, you know, and to hook people that way was just something else. Anyway, he's great. He's great. And to think it all started with baked beans. There's the quote. Let's now turn to feedback. And we have one long email that doesn't have a lot of like questions or anything. We might have a couple remarks, I would think. But before I have you read that, I did want to at least say and tell folks we had an email from Mr. Beast, who was asking me, how do I get this to perform where it's not too fast for me? Because he had tried it and he found it just demolished him because it was running too fast. If you're running in DosBox, which and I had emailed him about this already, but if you're running in DosBox, which I think at this point you'd have to be to play this game, unless you have an old PC lying around, you can use Control F11 to slow down your virtual machine and Control F12 to speed it up at any time. It's definitely one of the things up to about Dungeon Keeper with Bullfrog games. None of them used time in any of their calculations of how the game ran. The first time I played Dungeon Keeper, I got to a certain point. I had borrowed Chris Corey's copy at LucasArts. I was playing it at lunch one day. I'm like, man, this game gets really, really hard. And he came over and looked at it, and it was running so fast. And he was like, that's running too fast. And I was like, what do you mean? Because it had no
right, yeah, that was a problem with playing older games.
When you play a modern game, everything is based on how much time has elapsed since the last time I did a calculation. So if a ball is being thrown through the air or whatever, I multiply its velocity by the amount of time that has elapsed, and I find the new position, right? Back in the day, we didn't want to do all those extra multiplies because cycles were hard come by. And so they just didn't do any of those things. They didn't adjust for time. They just assumed everybody had a machine that was around the same in terms of performance. And as machines got faster, the games ran faster and everything moved faster. And so that's how you can control these. I think the GOG settings are not terrible. Like, you shouldn't need to do this, but if you are having problems, definitely. There was definitely a level here where I had restarted a number of times. I said, I'm going to slow this down just so I have time to get around the map, because the AI does cheat. So I got to give myself a little boost as well. Anyway, just throwing that out there. Why don't you go ahead and hit that mail?
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's a good one. I totally forgot about that. There's a couple games that it might have been actually XCOM is one that I was thinking of that I tried to play the original back in the day. No, but that was turn-based, so it wouldn't have been that one. Yeah, I don't remember what it was, but there's always some funny examples of that.
Syndicate would be one from Bullfrog that would have been in that time.
Syndicate, maybe, yeah. It could have been Dungeon Keeper. That actually was. That's probably my favorite game by him, by the way. I think it's the most interesting and just kind of great concept, and obviously loving dungeon stuff in general. But okay, so okay, here we go. So an email from Johnny Pockets. All right, here we go. Subject: some observations on the Japanese language. Good day, gentlemen. I started this email during Chrono Trigger, but Ace Attorney gave me the reason to finish it. That's great. Okay, Chrono Trigger topic. Ize of the world. I guess I'll pronounce it that way. He has it in quotes. Eyes? Oh, eyes. Okay, I thought it might have been Japanese or something. Okay, eyes of the world. That's what you, okay. You discuss the density of Japanese written language in Chrono Trigger. You might be familiar with things like honorifics in Japanese. Is that honorifics? Is that
yeah,
right?
honorific.
That impart meaning and nuance.
I'm guessing that you are not, apparently. You don't know what
no, I don't know that term, to be honest. For example, if I...
Mr. is an honorific.
Okay,
Sir,
all right.
sir, honorific.
Got it. Okay, I did not know that was... Okay, so for example, if I were addressing a colleague at work during an internal meeting, I might say, Brettson. Okay, obviously I know about that. I just did not know that was an honorific. If I were an executive in a traditional Japanese company, when addressing a new graduate, I might say Tim-kun. These two examples suggest certain information about the relative positions of the speakers. In the first example, Brettson, we are probably relatively equal in standing, but in the second example, Tim-kun, it is clear Tim is a junior member in the relationship in rank and age. This sort of direct marker does not exist so much in English, but is common in Japanese. I want to share an example of built-in meaning, in quotes, from the Japanese translation of the Harry Potter books. Okay, wow. In English, when characters refer to themselves, most use the word I. In Japanese, there are many different words to use for I, and they all impart some meaning. The large cast of Harry Potter provides a nice example of how they can be used. Here are some of the different characters often refer to themselves. Here are how the different characters often refer to themselves, i.e., as translated from the English word I. Note to the reader, I put the rough implied nuance in brackets when used by the character. Harry, Boku, young male. Hermione, Watashi, mature girl. Ginny, first couple of books. Atashi, immature girl. Dumbledore, Washi, eccentric old man. Hagrid, Ore, rough. You know who. He didn't even say it. I haven't even read the books and I know what he's doing there. Ore-sama, royalty, arrogance. Oh, interesting. And then Snape, Wagahai, Snape. Okay, they all really enforce the character's personality. The translator did an excellent job with this. That is super cool. And what a great example. I wonder if he just came up with that example. Yeah. Wow. Good work, Johnny Pockets. Good work. Okay. Section 2, ace topic. As he's finishing this mail. Sexism in Japan.
It's actually related in some ways.
Okay. Okay. Good. Good. I have faith in Johnny. Okay. Ace topic. Sexism.
Pockets the great.
Sexism in Japan. I'm not surprised. There is a lot to say around this topic, but I will just stick to the theme of language and make an observation. Sexism is embedded in the Japanese language. Before I explain my observation, you need to know some Japanese language basics. Japan uses Chinese characters as their main writing alphabet. A high school graduate will be expected to write and read about 2,000 characters, and a college graduate that actually studied should know about 3,000. So characters are very complex, and some characters are very complex and can have many strokes. A dozen is not unusual. But they are all made up of radicals. In Japanese, these radicals have meanings which usually have some sort of logic when considering the character. An example is the character for fish, where all characters that represent the type of fish, e.g. salmon, will have this fish character as a radical. Okay, cool. My daughter actually studied 3 years of Japanese, so she'd be interested in this letter. Back to my observation, when I went through the study and studied these characters, I noticed some trends, one of them being a negative connotation associated with characters containing the radical for female. I used mnemonics when studying and realized my mnemonic stories to learn these characters were
disproportionately.
Never can say that word. Disproportionately negative when a female was involved. It is not all bad. Some of them, such as like and gentle, are positive. Some of them, such as pregnancy and wife, make a lot of sense. but there does seem to be an awful lot with negative meanings. For example, bastard, servant, wicked, disturb, noisy, ugly, to name a few. Holy cow, are you serious? I did not get this feeling for the male equivalent. I'm not saying this aspect of the language is insidious. In languages like English, the usage can keep up with modernity, but Japanese is stuck with the decisions made by people many years ago with very different values, since the meanings are baked into the radicals. Yeah, that's a good point. Equivalent of letters in English. I can only continue to speculate about what sort of impact this might have, but if George Orwell is to be believed, it is not insignificant. Yeah. Best, Johnny Pockets. P.S. I really enjoyed the extended treatment you gave to Republic Commando, especially your surprise guests. I would be up for anything more of what those guys have made. Bring on the next 20 years. Yeah, don't count on it. Yeah, wow. Yeah, that was a humdinger of a mail.
He sent a ton of links to, looks like mostly gshow.org, which show you and one other kanji alive that actually give all of these examples that you had read in the second part. So if anybody's interested in those, I'm not going to put them in the show notes because there's a whole bunch of them. But if you are interested, I'll certainly forward that along, that part of the email along to you, because it's a lot of research, and I appreciate Pockets spending the time. Yeah, it's wild that that's just baked in. I've never thought about this in any way in, for example, Romance languages that have gender, because English doesn't have gender. I mean, we have some words that have gender, but not all words have gender. I mean, this has been a really wild thing in modern times in translation for video games, because if you want to translate, for example, they, them pronouns, non-gendered pronouns into, for example, Italian, they don't do that. Yeah. They don't have it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I didn't even think about it. I studied French.
Yeah, I read. Yeah, I mean, I also studied French, but I mean, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I had read an article about this of a translator of a game that had non-gendered pronouns, and how they addressed it, and they added their own. They basically added to the language. They added their own. I don't remember. It was like the letter O instead of A, or I don't know what they are in Italian. Might have been to Portuguese. I can't remember what language it was in particular that the translator came up with this. Like, hey, I need to convey this sense, into our language, and we don't have it. That it's literally not possible to say this in our language, and added, like you see this sometimes in science fiction, right? That I've seen certainly a lot of using she, as the default pronoun in science fiction books in the last, 20 years. But before that, I had seen non-gendered pronouns that weren't pronouns that we actually use as well. So I can't think of an example of that, but let's say like I think was one that I've seen, ER instead of her.
Right. Yep.
I think might be one.
Trying to
think of ways,
an evolution,
an evolution of the language to not carry sensation of gender into something that doesn't necessarily need to carry gender.
Fascinating.
Yeah, super interesting stuff. But yeah, having it baked into the particles, or the radicals rather. I'm
at that
little bits of little bits of the diagrams, because I've done martial arts, and there's enough. They'll show you the the kanji or something for something in Aikido or karate or whatever, and you'll be expected to be able to recognize that. And you can actually break down and understand, like, oh, this symbol in something is is wind or something like that. And you look at it and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I get that. I always thought about that, but I didn't know this about the sort of gendered particles being. It totally makes sense, but I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna have to ask my daughter about it and see if she had seen any of those trends, but she really enjoyed working, learning the language. And we do want to test her out by going to Japan someday, but as a family. But it was, that's some fascinating stuff. And it's completely good angle and example to talk about, the cultural aspects of what we were talking about with Ace Attorney, and
for sure,
and gender. Yeah. Thanks, Johnny. Another humdinger.
Yeah, I really appreciate. I love hearing about stuff like that, and I also believe that how we use language does have some impact on our thinking, which is why, I do try to be careful with my language. So, very much appreciated. I am sure I am not 100% on that, but I do my best. All right, well, that was sent to devgameclub@gmail.com. Thanks to Johnny and also Mr. Beast. I answer every email we get. If I don't answer for some reason, just ping me again, and maybe you got filtered out somehow. But that's where to find us. And we read most everything on the show as well, and you can send questions and what have you. So. We love our reviews when we get them, either through the podcast app on your Apple device or whatever listening app you use. Just go ahead and shoot it towards us if we don't read it and you have put it in somewhere. We appreciate each and every review. If you've already reviewed or you don't have that opportunity because apparently Google doesn't do that, go ahead and tell a friend. We are entirely supported by word of mouth. And of course, you can find us on the web at devgameclub.com and on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end. And I want to thank everybody who, I even had some additional pledges, donations, etc. for the trip after last episode. So thanks for that. Still a couple more weeks. Still very impressed with everyone on how much we made per mile. So around September 24th or 25th or so, when the time is up, I will be obviously donating that to Big City Mountaineers for their programs. So thanks again for all of that. Still a little bit left though, if you're interested in still donating.
Cool. I have not been streaming because my eyes finally got straightened out and I started having carpal tunnel problems. So I just can't win. Maybe someday. We'll see. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton and commissioned by friend of the cast, Errant Evers. Thank you to both of them. Have fun raining down hellfire on your enemies this week. And good night.
Good night.